Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the second episode of 2024. I hope you were all enjoying or have enjoyed the first episode that we recorded about Jesus not being a Palestinian. It's been a big hit so far. It's gotten more views than any of our recent podcasts, and it is quite edifying and entertaining. So I highly encourage you watch that, especially if you are going to watch this one. This one's going to be a far more weightier one, if you will, because it's a very serious topic, and there really isn't much to joke about it. It's also a topic that Adam and I do not necessarily agree on, so that should make for an interesting conversation. But I will also add that Adam knows far more about this topic than I do, since it falls into his area. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the judicial reforms in Israel, since there was a major turning point in what has been unfolding since last spring, and that took place this week. So there's a lot to talk about with that. Many people might not have noticed because of the ongoing war, which is relevant. But, Adam is very much pro-judicial reforms, and I am more, I'm not necessarily against them, but I'm more on the fence with them. And my issue is that I'm very suspicious of the motives of the political actors who have so much invested in these reforms. That doesn't mean I'm against, in theory, the idea that there needs to be some sort of judicial overhaul in Israel. But I'm going to turn the mic over to Adam, and he is going to just lay out what the situation is, what the bigger questions are, and address why he thinks what happened this week is a problem.
Yeah, so this all began, well, actually, it all began years ago, but the current process began last spring when the Knesset, which had just been, the right-wing parties had just created a coalition, decided to pass legislation that would amend the basic law on the judiciary to do a few different things. There were a couple of different things that were highly contentious within Israeli society. One of them in particular was the removal of what is known as the reasonableness doctrine, which is a tool of the judiciary to rule on cases on the basis of the reasonableness of the laws that have been passed. So if the court is confronted with some kind of case involving a law that the Knesset has passed, it can rule on the basis of whether or not the judges on the court believe that that law is in fact reasonable. Now, these judicial reforms had other things too that were.
Adam, I think we need to. If I could interrupt, I think we need to zoom out for a second, because I don't think many of, or most of our viewers understand the constitutional process.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
Well, and they don't know what basic laws are. I mean, I really didn't know much about it.
Fair enough. All right. So Israel has no constitution. And the reason it has no constitution is because when Israel was first created in 1948, there were just way too many visions of what the state should be like.
Way too many controversial visions, right?
Controversial visions.
Yeah.
There were so many different diverse Zionisms at the time. And David Ben-Gurion wisely at the time decided to shelve the debate over the Constitution. And at some point in the future, down the road, Israel would have some kind of constitutional convention and finally write one.
Now, as a British colony, which Palestine was, it's not something that's totally out of left field, given that Britain doesn't have a written constitution.
But they have a constitution, right?
Of sorts, yeah.
They do. Israel has no constitution. New Zealand also is another country that doesn't have a constitution. So it's not entirely unprecedented, but
and Hamas isn't trying to destroy them, which is an important
point. That's true. Right. Now, Israel's lack of a constitution is a much bigger problem than it is for any of these Commonwealth countries that may lack a constitution. And largely because of the fact that it is such a pluralistic society in Israel, and they have all of these different visions as to what Israel is supposed to be like. And anyway, so as a result of not having a constitution, they decided to, because you need to have some sort of basis of governance. They decided to have what's called basic laws or fundamental laws of government, which would eventually, at some point down the road, become the basis of a constitution that would be drafted, right? So a basic law is able to be made very easily. This is something a lot of people don't seem to be aware of, except for a couple of the basic laws that have provisions within them requiring a certain threshold of a vote in order to change. Most of the basic laws can be amended with a simple majority of the Knesset, which means 61 out of 120 voting members can basically change a basic law or add a new one, right? Like they added a new one a couple of years ago when they passed the nation state basic law. That was passed with a little bit more than a simple majority, but it definitely did not constitute this kind of overwhelming consensus that a constitutional amendment in the United States would require, or in most countries would require. So it's very easy to change them, except for the basic law on human dignity and liberty, which is basically Israel's version of our First Amendment, right? It provides all those civil liberties, and built in within it is the provision that it would require a much higher threshold than just a simple majority in order to change. And it also stipulates that that this particular basic law cannot be reversed or thwarted in any way by the creation of a new basic law. That was something that was actually on the table when the court scrutinized the nation state basic law. The question is, does the nation state basic law violate the basic law on human dignity and liberty? It was decided that it does not, so the nation state basic law went forward.
Okay, so who decided that? Did the Knesset decide it, or did the Supreme Court?
Court.
Okay, so the court did rule on that because it was a new basic law. They had the authority to do that.
Yeah, it was in the court system. I'm not 100% sure that it went all the way up to the high court, but I'm pretty sure it did. Right?
Okay, but the point is there is judicial oversight of some sort.
There is judicial oversight, of course. Yeah.
Now, because again, in terms of like what constitutes a basic law and what constitutes something that can be changed, what if the Knesset voted to expand the number of seats that it had from 120 to 150? Would they have the authority to do that? If 60,
yeah, well, I believe that they would. I don't think that the basic law on the Knesset actually says 120 seats. I'm gonna have to, that's a good question. I need to go and look that up. I'm pretty sure it does not actually specify the number 120. That, of course, though, is no different than the fact that in our country, in the United States, it doesn't actually say that there has to be 9 Supreme Court justices.
Okay, more concrete question.
Yeah.
They've changed, for those of you who know something about Israeli politics, you know they have a proportional representation system where, you know, they count the percentage of the population that voted for a particular party, and that party gets X number of seats. They changed the minimum threshold at least once in Israeli history, right? So if a party doesn't get X percentage of the popular vote, they do not get any seats. So you won't have all these parties that get like, you know, 0.5% of the vote getting seats in the Knesset, making it incredibly unwieldy. Now they have
that doesn't happen. There's a threshold.
Yeah, but they've changed the threshold law, right? They've changed it.
They've increased it a couple of times. It's at 3.25%.
Okay, but so the Knesset has the authority to change that.
Yes.
Now, does the Judiciary have the right to overrule that? Because that to me is a really fundamental, law here, right?
Well, if you assume that they have the right to rule on the reasonableness of law. And now, as of yesterday, reasonableness of law includes basic laws. Then yes, the Supreme Court should be permitted to rule that no, it's unreasonable to increase the threshold from 3.25 to say 3.75.
I mean, imagine if they decided to increase it to 10%. That would totally, upend the makeup of the Knesset.
Yes, it would. Or maybe to a more a more likely example would be to eliminate the threshold entirely. So there are politicians in Israel that want to eliminate it, that argue that it is in fact unreasonable. Suppose that doesn't happen, but you have a majority of the court that say that it's unreasonable to require a 3.25% threshold. And we're going to now nullify that requirement, right?
The Supreme Court can overrule that. That's the question.
Well, it's unprecedented for them to do that, but now it is precedented that the Supreme Court can overturn basic laws on the reasonableness standard.
Right. So ultimately, the question, at least in my mind, rests on who has the power to fundamentally change or veto changes to what, in effect, or for all intents and purposes, is Israel's constitution. That, to me, is how I'm seeing this entire thing, without getting into the weeds of the reforms themselves.
Right. And obviously, there's a huge problem, irrespective of this issue over the court's power. The problem is that, I'm personally not comfortable, or wouldn't be if I were an Israeli citizen, which I'm not, wouldn't be comfortable with the Knesset, through a simple majority, being able to amend the Constitution for all intents and purposes. That in of itself is a problem. I think that if there are constitutional amendments, it should be done through consensus, right? It should be very difficult to amend a constitution. That's why I fully supported issue 1 back on the Ohio ballot over the summer, which would have required that an amendment to the Ohio state constitution required a threshold of 60% of the vote. Which that of course failed. That didn't pass because the opposition felt that this somehow flies in the face of democracy. That if this all you should have is a simple majority, you shouldn't have a higher threshold to meet. But for me, I think it just simply makes sense. Yeah, it's too easy for the Knesset to amend their basic laws. But having said that, though, all right, this is my caveat. Even though it is too easy for them to amend it, it's interesting how rare that they do amend it, given how easy it is. The members of the Knesset are actually very reluctant to amend the basic laws, right? If there is a discussion, a reading of a bill that would do that, they take it, the individual members take that more seriously and are more loath to actually vote yes if it's an amendment to a basic law or the creation of a new basic law than if it's just a regular statute.
The current members and the members until now. Who knows who will be elected in the future?
But it's always been that way, that they've been more careful when it came to basic laws.
Yeah, but what if morons like Marjorie Taylor Greene come to power in Israel?
Well, we already have morons like that in the Knesset, right? Like the Knesset is like any legislative assembly on this earth in any democratic country, where you've got all kinds of loudmouth bozos, right? That's what a legislature is. That's the definition of a legislature. A collection of people that represent all kinds of very vocal factions.
Right. So 2 other things, and one of them is the question for you to explain. One, viewers might not know, but most probably do, that Israel is a unicameral government. Did I use the right word there? So it only has one legislative chamber. There's no equivalent of the Senate, and the government is formed much like it is in Canada and other places by whoever can put together, whoever can hold together a majority number of seats and actually form a government out of that, with the prime minister being head of the government. the other thing, you need to explain this also, given that there's two players here, the Knesset and the Judiciary. How do judges get appointed to the Supreme Court? What is the nature of the Supreme Court? Because, again, people think like the United States, okay, so this is how Supreme Court judges come,
Well, this is interesting because the proposed reforms back in the spring would have amended this process. That part of it didn't go through yet. But the way that they are appointed is that there's a selection committee that comprises various players. The committee does have representation from the Knesset, from the government, and actually, I believe that even the opposition even has representation on this committee, but also members of the judiciary, sitting active judges have representation on this committee. And most controversial of all is that the Israeli Bar Association has representation on this committee. So I mean, that would be like the American Bar Association, the ABA, getting to be involved in the selection of our Supreme Court justices. Now, a lot of you at home that are watching this are probably thinking, wow, that makes sense. Sure, that's a good idea. But I would just say that seems to be very very problematic, where you now have a conflict of interest, where the very people that are going to gain or lose by verdicts that are issued by the judges get to be part of the selection process over who those judges are. Why should the people that are just admitted to the bar have any greater right or authority over the selection of people with actual government power than the citizens of the voting citizens of that country?
But you could say the same thing about the Knesset. They get elected and they vote an amendment to a basic law, which, let's say, extends their terms to 20 years.
But they're voted there, though, right? They're voted there. And I don't think that
this is a matter of whether you trust the population more or you trust a professional bureaucracy more. I think that's an issue here. A professionalized bureaucracy of sorts.
It's not a question of trust. You can change the voters can change things. The bureaucracy stays the same. I mean, they operate on these kinds of standard operating procedures, these protocols. And they have this kind of organizational behavior that they always abide by, and they're going to do what they're going to do, and there's no changing them. That is tantamount to tyranny when you have the same people with their own organizational interests at stake that get to decide who's going to be our representatives in government and who the powers that be are going to comprise. I would much rather leave it to the voters, because the voters at least are fickle, right? That in this case, that's actually a good thing. Usually the word fickle denotes something negative, but it's helpful here because one year they want one thing, the next year they want another thing, right? So I don't think
that's not necessarily a good thing.
Look, it's a good thing in this case. It's not necessarily a good thing, but in this case,
I can name countries where that definitely wouldn't be a good thing.
Okay. Well, let's take your example, though.
An example, I can name a half a dozen Middle Eastern countries.
The example you just gave was, suppose they want to change the basic law to give themselves 20 years before they have to face re-election, right? I will submit to you that such a government that does that is going to fall next week. It's not going to stay in place.
If everyone in the coalition signs off on it, why would it fall?
Because well, look, not everybody in the coalition is going to sign off on it.
Why wouldn't they? They're going to be in power for 2 decades. What's their incentive to not do that?
Because they're not only interested in power, they have all kinds of course, that is a big interest of theirs, but they have all kinds of interests towards their constituents.
I mean, this is pretty much what happened in Russia with Putin. I mean, he was able to manipulate the constitutional process that Yeltsin had instituted in order to ensure that he basically reigns in perpetuity. I mean,
but he controls the oligarchs.
He controls the oligarchs, but
And the oligarchs in this case is comparable to the Supreme Court members.
Yes, but arguably Yeltsin's constitution, even though it involved basically open firing on parliament and killing hundreds of people, the constitution that he passed, and it's a very sophisticated constitution if you were to read it. It has both the proportional representation section for the legislature and the majoritarian portion. So it really seeks to balance out regional interests versus like the general will, if you will. There's nothing wrong with the constitution that he put in power, but it was still had mechanisms in it for someone like Putin and his supporters to basically manipulate in such a way. Putin was only supposed to be in power for 2 presidential terms. There's a 2 presidential term limit in Russia.
And then it was Medvedev for a while.
Yes, but he wasn't supposed to be able to come back, Putin. But somehow, and I did look it up and read up on it once, he was able to railroad legislation through during that time. And Parliament signed off on it because, again, the morons who voted these other morons into power couldn't care less. Ensured that Putin would be able to basically extend his rule and pass other legislation to turn Russia back into an autocratic state. So
you can't compare the 2 situations.
The only reason they're not comparable is that Israel has a democratic political culture, right? I agree that it's not part of the cultural practices of the people of Israel to do such things, but the possibility is still open, right? So there's enough. Whereas I don't think in the American Constitution pulling something like that off would be very easy.
Well, I don't know. In the United States, we seem to have, or have had for quite a long time, a lot of unanimity between the interests of all 3 branches of government. If you look at the United States, where we went for like a 50-year span of time, 1932 to 1994, with one party controlling the House of Representatives, all but on 2 occasions during that span of time. The possibilities of one party control is just as possible in the U.S. as anywhere.
I'm not necessarily a fan of the way Supreme Court judges get appointed in the United States,
but this doesn't even have anything to do with the Supreme Court.
Well, they're one of the branches.
But then if you look at the Supreme Court, I mean, we had a 70-year hegemony of the liberal progressive wing controlling the Supreme Court. Only now has it become conservative, right? But we went for a long-standing amount of time in that direction. And so, anyway, let's get back to this issue, right? Of this particular amendment, right? So, what happened? So the High Court yesterday, which was Monday, overturned the amendments to the basic law on the judiciary, which overturns the reasonableness standard. They called the reasonableness, they called the overturning of the reasonableness standard unreasonable. And actually, it was not a unanimous vote. It was actually a split decision. It was like slightly more than half. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was slight. I mean, it was a very slight majority that ruled that way.
I'm not sure I know what reason. I'm not sure I know what the reasonableness standard means exactly. I'm not.
All right, the reasonableness standard is simply, is it reasonable what the legislature has passed?
Isn't that the equivalent of our Supreme Court using precedent?
No, it's completely different because, well, first of all, you could argue that relying on precedent is not good either. But I'm not going to make that argument, and I don't think that it has anything to do with this either. But no, because precedent is built on case law, right? So a court at one time ruled X, and here's the reason for X. That becomes case law, and all decisions that come later will reflect that case law. Either that decision will stand and there need not be any further trials or hearings at all on cases that exactly mirror what happened in that case law, or there's a case that's slightly different that needs to be heard, and the verdict and a written opinion that is issued will slightly revise that case law in the same sense that, you know, the Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision builds on the Roe v. Wade decision, right? Things like that. So that's not the same thing. What we're talking about with the reasonableness standard is this particular law unreasonable? Like, did the Knesset pass a law that is just unreasonable?
I don't understand what that means. Again, so which sort of supports your position.
If you go back to a lot of the history involving it, much of it was it derived from the clash between the religious and the non-religious, right? So if the Knesset passes a law that is obviously religious in nature, you know, pushing halacha on the people of Israel, the Supreme Court can apply a reasonableness standard and say, wait a minute here. It's not reasonable that all Israelis are expected to adhere to Jewish law, something like that, right? And in that case, I suppose that there is maybe a possible argument to be made here, but even then I wouldn't make it, right? Because I simply believe that the question over whether or not a law is reasonable is entirely a legislative question. It's not a question that should be taken up by the judiciary.
So wait a sec. If the Knesset were to vote to impose kashrut on the entire country, you believe that the court should not have the authority to overrule that?
Well, not on the basis of the reasonableness standard. Now, you could argue that there are things built into the basic laws already that could be cited as justifications to rule such a thing unlawful. Maybe like the human dignity and liberty basic law. I mean, like there was the case involving the hospitals were not allowed to prohibit chametz during Passover, right? So the government, you know, issues that tells the hospitals that they're not allowed to prohibit that, something like that, you know, on the basis of laws that are already on the books that require that there's not a merging of synagogue and state that goes too far. Right.
So you believe that you believe if the legislation had gone through and the Supreme Court accepted that the legislature can overrule or do something that the Supreme Court would normally otherwise find unreasonable, you believe that the Supreme Court would still have the authority to strike down something like the chametz incident or anything else that involves the
only if there's a justification already in I keep trying to say constitution. There's no constitution. Only if there's something already enshrined within the basic laws or within any law, right? So the court should not be establishing its own laws. It should only rule based on what the laws.
But why can't they rule? Why can't they modify an existing basic law to say that Israel is going to be a theocracy? Nobody's allowed to drive a car on Saturday, and everyone has to keep kosher. What's prevent?
You mean what prevents the court from doing that?
No, what prevents the legislature from doing that if the proposed judicial reforms had gone through?
They get voted out in the next election.
Yes, but there's changing demographics in Israel, and based on the Haredi reproductive rate, I think that at some point the Hasids and company are going to outnumber the those who frolic on the beaches of Tel Aviv.
It's very possible that Israel has a looming problem ahead of them.
Well, I think
that problem is not to be solved by the Supreme Court becoming the be all and end all of becoming like an overlord over the Israeli people. Let me throw that back at you. Suppose with the changing demographics in Israel, which is happening as you are saying, eventually maybe the Supreme Court itself becomes Haredi, right? And
That's
now
a
you have
possibility.
you have the tables turned. Suppose you have a Knesset that is controlled by a secular coalition, but somehow or another the High Court got to be controlled by the Haredim. I mean, by applying the reasonableness standard, they can do whatever they want, right?
Yes, but I have no.
And the liberals in the United States are finding out about this now. Like the conservative Supreme Court that just overturned Roe v. Wade last year is really a creature of the left's creation. They wanted a court that would be a check on the legislative branch, right? That's what they wanted, and that's what they got. So suppose you have a different ideological makeup of the court.
No, that's a valid point. But I'm not sure that, transforming the country into a complete theocracy is the same as banning abortion, given that it's such a controversial issue and has been, for the past century. I mean, we're talking about the United States, which, was more or less founded on the principle.
I'm not just talking about, go finish your point.
Well, it's just the United States was founded on the principle of religious freedom and whatnot. I'm just thinking in Israel, I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical that there would be a Haredi Supreme Court. I find it far more likely that the legislature would become dominated by Haredim than the Supreme Court would.
Well, but suppose you have a Supreme Court, because you're right. I mean, it's unlikely, but it's certainly possible. But suppose you instead have a Supreme Court that, consists of RZs, religious Zionists. That's a lot more likely possibility. Suppose that happens down the road. And it doesn't have to be all of them. It just has to be a majority of them.
Mm-hmm. Right. I guess that's a valid point. I mean,
watch out who you give power to, because you're going to regret it.
I just think that the legislature is far more susceptible to populism of such a nature than an institution of professional lawyers.
The founders of the United States, our American framers, were well aware that tyranny exists at all three levels of government. You have legislative tyranny, you have executive tyranny, and you have judicial tyranny. And they were well cognizant of this, and they built into our system ways to get around it, right? That's the genius of our system. They knew that judicial tyranny would be possible, so they gave the president the power of the pardon, and they gave Congress the power of impeachment, judicial powers that belong to non-judicial branches. They understood that Congress has the potential for legislative tyranny, so they give the president the veto power, right?
Well, I'm reluctant to use the word genius in conjunction with the American government. I still do. I guess I do agree that this is more a comment on contemporary American politics, but I do agree that, yes, the checks and balances in the American system are very well thought out and do more or less work, I think.
What is the check on judicial power in Israel? That is the question that I would like opponents of these reforms to answer.
No, the question is,
I've asked this question to all of them, and they have not been able to answer that.
No, the actual question, and I'm someone in the middle here. I'm not on either side of this, because I do think that there does need to be reforms. I think that you've aptly demonstrated that the judiciary is unaccountable in many ways and can, in theory, do a lot of damage without being accountable to the people, without reflecting the will of the people. But the question is not, what is the check, but the question is, what should the check be? And I'm not sure that these judicial reforms are offering an effective check on the power of the judiciary.
Oh, so you agree that there should be a check?
Yeah, no, I think the Israeli system is.
And you agree that there is no check?
My opinion, and I'll just throw in a little bit of history here, since that's what I do, is I think the fact that Israel is a functioning democracy is, aside from the revival of Hebrew, is probably the greatest achievement that Israel has accomplished. And I know I've said it before on previous episodes, but you look at how Israel came into being, okay? And I always tell my classes, and how Israel became a democracy. One, The ideology upon which Zionism comes out of, or the ideologies, was formed in the Pale settlement in the early 20th century. Especially the second Aliyah folks like Ben Gurion. They're straight out of the same demographic that invented Bolshevism, Menshevism, Bundism, Polish nationalism, Ukrainian nationalism. These are all the same people. They rejected liberalism and democracy because the Russian Empire needed radical solutions to its problems, illiberal solutions. So that in and of itself suggests that Zionism, in its inception, is an illiberal ideology. I'm not saying Zionism is illiberalism by definition. I'm just talking about its very origins in terms of the people who are going back and forth between different movements at the time. So that's point one. Point two, in this regard, is that Israel came into being in a state of war with people, with the British on one hand and the Arabs on the other hand, wanting to chase them into the sea and wipe the newly formed state off the map. That's a situation that's hardly conducive to democracy. You also had a situation where there were multiple factions in Israel, most notably the Irgun versus the more mainstream Haganah. And, I would say it's a miracle that the Irgun did lay down their weapons with that brief Italia, what's the word? The Italia incident?
You mean the you mean the ship that was
Yeah. So the Irgun laid down their weapons.
Yeah,
We could have ended up with some sort of banana republic with a militant faction that said, no, these are our enemies and we don't want to have anything to do with them. Israel could have easily ended up in a state of civil war between the Irgun and the Haganah. Then we add to the fact Israel has no constitution, and we also add to the fact that Israel, for its entire history, or at least until the late 70s, was surrounded by states that were literally trying to wipe it off the map and have been in a state of warfare for its entire history. And in terms of the population, it wasn't just the first original people who came over, but who else helped build Israel? Well, refugees from Nazi Germany who were not exactly, inclined towards democracy given the region that they came from. Mizrahi Jews now make up 60% of the population, which means these are people who did not come from democratic states. There's no reason to think their political culture should be any different than Arabs, given that they've lived there for 1,500 years. Yet somehow, and the entire neighborhood, look at the neighborhood Israel's in, the Middle East, yet somehow Israel is a democracy.
Even Israeli Arabs practice democracy.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely remarkable that Israel has been able to achieve it without a written constitution. And that's kind of the scary part, right? That, should something go wrong or have gone wrong, they don't have this written document to fall back on and to hope that, the people will, at the end of the day, support. It was a very, very risky thing to do, to not have a constitution. So I think, I'm not sure what my point was here originally, but my point was that Israel has proven to be an effective democracy without having these checks and balances built into it. And so I agree with that. You said that earlier, that without having the checks and balances built into it, that the United States has. But I do think that checks and balances are needed. And I do think there needs to be some sort of reform, because I think the power imbalance, or the imbalance isn't the right word, but the hurdles for ensuring a conflict between the two branches of government, given there are hurdles there that would prevent a peaceful resolution of conflict should a conflict emerge. That's my opinion. So I agree that change needs to be needed, but I question that the proposed changes are the correct changes, because I think that's just shifting the balance of power to one branch of government. And
it seems to me that if someone is very wary of the trend that Israeli society is moving towards the right, where we now see the right-wing bloc winning elections year after year after year, should actually embrace this new set of judicial reforms, because a lot of the more extreme things, or seem to be extreme things, that are passed by the Knesset and overturned by the court are not given a chance to actually show that they're failures, that they're bad ideas. Let them become a law, and execute them as law and see where it goes, right?
Well, I mean, if it's going to go in a disastrous direction, that might be something that would be best
Sometimes you need
avoided.
to make disaster in order to affect change.
Yeah, that sounds a little bit Leninist in its in its word in the wording, but okay, I'll let that go. But so my other question, and I think this is pertinent to what I just said about political culture, democratic political culture. The question is, why now? Why these particular individuals? Because at the end of the day, this is not just about institutions, it's about individuals. So why is this current the most right-wing government in
This,
history?
no, I reject the premise of your question, because this has been something that the right-wing bloc has been itching to do for decades. This is not anything new that suddenly happened all of a sudden.
It's new because the right wing has more power now than they did in the past. So my question to you
That's
is why?
well, yes, because the for the longest time there was a party, a centrist party that was absolutely vital for coalition building, called Kulanu, which was completely against any kind of judicial reform, and Bibi always knew that.
Okay, so then why does the political right, okay, people that I really don't share an
They have the
ideological
power now to
outlook,
do it. That's why
what, because what?
they have the power now to do it.
Okay, but why do they want them? Why does the right want this and not the left or the
Because
centrist?
they're tired of seeing their reforms overturned by the court.
For example,
Well, like there was the case involving um, the Temple Mount, which would allow prayer, Jewish prayer at the Temple Mount. This was overturned by the Supreme Court, right? These kind of things just keep happening.
now, in terms of that particular one, since you brought it up, while I personally believe that Jews should be allowed to pray wherever the hell they want, and if anyone wants to go to the Temple Mount and pray in whatever religion they belong to, that's fine. That's my personal belief. I get the logic of the Supreme Court here, right? And one can even argue that theologically there is a foundation for their view, because you are not allowed to, a Jew is not allowed to enter the Holy of the Holies by accident, which means their movement and what they do in the Temple Mount.
All right, so far you have suggested, not necessarily outright, but through implication, that number one, the Supreme Court must act as rabbis and make rabbinical rulings, and interpret Jewish law.
No, that's just the irony of the whole situation.
And you have also implied here that the Supreme Court must assure Israeli security, right?
So what was the Supreme Court's argument about overruling the Temple Mount rule?
I don't even remember. It was on the reasonableness standard. Right? There were a number of these kinds. I mean, it happens all the time, right? Where you have these. There were the ruling about shutting off the electricity in Gaza, right, as a form of punishment for rockets, which this was years and years and years ago, overturned as unreasonable by the High Court.
Okay, well then this brings me to my next question, and that is, to what extent, let's leave theocracy aside here for the moment, even though I think that a yearning for theocracy is playing a role on some of the people pushing for this stuff, but to what extent is this being driven by people who want to exert greater force against the Palestinians in terms of how the conflict plays out? That they're hopeful that without the Supreme Court check, they will be able to.
I'm sure there's some of that. In fact, I'm sure there's a lot of that.
Okay. Now, is that necessarily a good thing?
I'm not saying that it's a good thing. I'm not here to weigh in on whether or not the consequences of the overturning of the of this amendment to the judiciary basic law are good or not. I'm not making any kind of statement on that. That we could talk about in another podcast.
Well, is that important? I mean, you're living in a political bubble here. You're talking about what you're doing is grounded in the realm of political theory and in a perfect world about how institutions should.
No, I completely reject the premise that we have to design our constitutional system on the basis of what kinds of policies are going to be enacted by it.
Well,
No,
no, we have to decide it on the basis of what are the possible disastrous outcomes in a worst case scenario. We need checks to ensure that the extremist outcomes do not become instituted, be it the left or the right.
well, look, our own system is based on Madison's model, which uses the idea that factions can be weeded out through all different ways. The system of separation of powers, the small legislature, the bicameral legislature, which each represents different parts of the country, states versus the people, things like that. That is the best way, I think, to deal with the problem of faction so that you end up with government that is only based on consensus. The problem that progressives have with our system is that it means that you can't have robust, bold, far-reaching legislation passed. I mean, this system that we have is the very reason, actually, that the United States doesn't have a national healthcare system, because it just requires way too many people to weigh in on the drafting of law that would create such a program, right? I mean, our system could not even enact Obamacare in its original form, even with the Democrats controlling all three branches of government and a supermajority in the Senate. The Democrats still had to keep taking things out of that original Obamacare bill in order to make it pass. So our system is based on the Madisonian model, which suggests that the best kind of government is the government that governs least, right? So you want to temper policy. So only things that are going to appeal to as wide an array of the public are going to be enacted. Now,
and giving a vast amount of power to the states, the individuals.
Giving a lot more power to the states as well, having a federalist system that has state constitutions with their own autonomy that give certain powers to the national government and only those, right? Although
and two-thirds of the states required to amend the Constitution.
3/4.
3/4, so it's that hard.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. So, right. So, yeah. But Israel obviously doesn't have anything like that. What Israel does have, though, is, I think, the PR system, the proportional representation system, which I think I'm not a fan of it, right? I think it's very problematic. I definitely don't want to ever see it come here, and I oppose it, or I counsel other countries not to do the same thing. Because it's really the creation of a monster in many ways. But I do think that it's probably the very thing, at least in Israel's case, in that context, that makes sure that you don't have extreme policies.
Well, it's also that Israel's a much smaller country. I mean, the United States has demographic variation across.
So do we, but so do we. I mean, so
that's what I'm saying. We do.
So does Israel. Israel does too. Israel's just as pluralistic as the United States, if not more so.
It's pluralistic. I don't think you can divide it into little boxes the same way you could divide the United States.
No, Israel is far where I'll demonstrate it for you really quickly. So,
where's your white chalkboard you were boasting so much of before we are introduced?
All right. So, look, so the United States has a very simple political spectrum. Imagine that I am capable of drawing evenly, which I haven't. Imagine this is a very simple bell curve, which it isn't, right? So this is the American system. You know, we have a left and we have a right and a center where most people fall. Now, that's the United States, and I'll show you Canada since you are a Canadian, right?
Sometimes.
All right, since you used to be a Canadian, I guess. That's Canada right there, right? This here is Quebec. They have an interest here in Quebec that the rest of the country is not interested in, which is the preservation of the French language. And that particular faction has a left and a right. You know, it's far left, doesn't care about the issue at all. The far right cares about it so much that it's willing to secede from the rest of the country. Most people fall somewhere in the middle, right? All right, so that's Canada.
Okay, now hold on. That stupid system that Canada has allowed the Bloc Québécois to become the opposition party. in past
Yeah,
federal legislators.
because Canada has power sharing. They have a disproportionate number of seats given to Quebec.
It's not just that; it's just the nature of given that the majoritarian system and the number of people who reside in Quebec, it's going to skew things in favor of geography, of geographical outcomes. If Canada had a proportional representation system rather than a majoritarian system, I don't think Quebec has a disproportional number of seats because they're French. They have disproportional powers, but that's something else. But I think in terms of the seats, it's demographic as it is everywhere else. But the population is so much larger in Quebec. And because each riding gets elected based on a simple majority within that riding, it's going to, let's just say the Separatist Party in the federal government gets 60% of the vote in every riding. They're going to get every single seat from Quebec, right? In a proportional representation system, that couldn't happen.
I believe that in not the last election, but the election before that, where Trudeau, are we on Trudeau's third stint of power or second?
I don't know. I've lost track of him.
Okay, well, I think it was on his direct re-election, because he was pushing for proportional representation, and the opposition was against it, right? If memory serves.
Well, given that Quebec's never actually signed our current constitution,
right. Well, I believe that what actually would have happened if they had gone with the PR system as Trudeau wanted, would have been fewer seats for Trudeau. Now, I don't know if what that implies though in terms of the Bloc Québécois.
I don't know. I don't even know if they're still around. Let's not bore our viewer with.
All right, let's not bore.
I'll just add as an aside here that my first semester in college, I was actually a political science major. I dropped political theory on the second week, and I regret that because Charles Taylor and Jim Tully were two of the co-teachers, and they're very famous people. I should have stuck with that. I took an IR course, which I realized was complete bullshit, but I was stuck with it for the semester. And my third course was Government of Canada, which I can assure you was absolutely the most boring class I have ever taken in my life. So I switched to becoming a history major.
I won't comment on that. I've never taken.
I took a U.S. history class, and that was great. So I said, let's major in history instead.
So this is Israel. This is Israel right here, right?
Okay, it looks like the back of a Dimetrodon or one of those.
Yeah, something like that. You have several different spectrums existing on the same plane, right? So whether or not the proportional representation system is the only way for all of these various groups to have representation,
right? Of course.
Right? And so if you were to do it just a simple way of first past the post with single member districting,
yeah,
you would end up with a lot of people feeling very disenfranchised.
Absolutely.
That are not getting any representation.
Yeah, no, that would be a problem. No, I'm not advocating
right?
that.
And so that is what keeps the various players involved and prevents the kind of extremist policies that you're saying would happen.
It also explains why Israel had 5 elections in 4 years, but
Well, there's that. Well, that would not have happened if it wasn't for the threshold.
Okay. So we see that the whole system is kind of problematic in its current formation. So let's wrap things up here then. What's the future? What's going to be the outcome of this, and what will happen, or what should happen and what will happen?
Well, if there was not a war going on, there would be riots in the streets right now, right? And I don't know which one is better, which one's worse. I mean, they're both bad. I don't want either of them, right? The war seems to have solidified, created more unity in Israel that was breaking down as a result of these judicial reforms months ago. But I'm not going to go and say that the war is a good thing because it did that, but it did do that. I don't know what's going to happen in the long run. At some point, this war is going to be concluded. At some point, the government is going to go back to its original form, which meant that the unity parties are going to leave the coalition, and it's going to be a return to, the same parties that were in it before the war.
No, it's not. Bibi's going to be ousted unless he puts forth some sort of miraculous victory in this war.
Well, I mean, that could happen, but with the same parties involved.
Hmm. In terms of riots, have there been violent riots in Israeli history of such a nature?
Well, yeah, you had the I can't understand why it's neither of us are getting it. It's right on the tip of my tongue. The event involving the ship.
Well, the ship was called either the Alita or the Italia or something like that.
No, it wasn't. Why can't I think of it?
Keep talking, I'm Googling it.
Yeah, but there have been riots in the past. I mean, there were riots in the 90s with during the Oslo Accords.
How I don't remember them. How severe were the riots?
Fairly severe. I mean, a prime minister got assassinated.
Well, yeah, okay. I mean, but aside from that, I mean, obviously that's but I mean there could be an assassination without mass riots in the streets. Were there actual like riots with other casualties? And
yes, on several occasions. I don't know if anything ever happened to the same kind of breakdown of civil society as what we saw earlier last year. Altalena affair.
Altalena. Okay, that was Vladimir Jabotinsky's alias that he used at a time when he was in Italy writing for one of the, I believe, Odessa newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Adelina affair. Okay, but that again, you're going back to 1948. I mean, that's
there have been incidents of violent unrest in Israel, but I think that what we saw last spring and into the summer was unprecedented to that level. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. No, that is a concern. Yeah, but I still don't see it as resulting in a breakdown of civil society and a degeneration into civil war or anything like that.
Well, at the time, there were many who thought so. When you also considered that there were actual IDF reservist officers that refused to remain in the reserves as a result, and we're actually talking civil war. I mean, that was actually something that was even being uttered.
Have you noticed that Jews tend to be alarmists?
That's true. That's true. Yeah. The sky is always falling when it comes to us. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, even the negation of the diaspora and the rebuilding of the states and the end of our exilic condition did not change that.
Mm-hmm.
We remain an alarmist people. Well, we're nearing the hour mark. I might have passed it even. Do you have any final words here?
No.
I've been enlightened to a little bit more of the details about what's going on.
Well, what do you want to know more?
No, I think I know enough at this point. And I also know that I don't trust the current prime minister of Israel. I don't like the man, and I don't like his coalition partners, and I'm very suspicious of anything that they're trying to do. I mean,
I'm suspicious of anything any politician tries to do.
You're right, and that's why I prefer the status quo, at least. I think the status quo.
But as much as I dislike politicians, I hate bureaucrats even more.
Okay, that's reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm a historian. I could pick examples throughout history that show you're right and examples that show you're wrong. So yeah, I think it could go either way on that count. But I will say in the current actors that are involved, I deeply mistrust Israel's current government. I detest some of the people in it. And I would rather leave well enough alone until they figure out a better way to fix what is genuinely a problem that needs fixing.
I like this solution.
You like my solution?
I like this solution. The overturn. Well, I mean, it's been overturned by the court, so it's a moot point.
Yeah, yeah.
But I supported it, and I think it's very disappointing, but not surprising because
you would support it if the left raised it. Is that what you're saying? If it was not a right-wing government that proposed this?
I don't care who proposes it.
Okay.
But the thing is that the left is inconsistent when it comes to this very kind of question. Their idea of good government is whatever is going to produce progressive results for them. My idea of good government.
That's like the left and the right. It's like anyone. I mean, that's all politicians.
I don't think
and
that this. I don't think that this is something that you'll necessarily find that much on the right. Like, obviously, politicians on the right are going to try to grasp at any straws they possibly can, just like the left would. But I think that there's a lot more appreciation on the right for process than there is on the left. But the right has always lived by this idea that
Ben Gvir is a man who appreciates process.
What's that?
Ben Gvir is a man who appreciates process.
No, obviously he doesn't. But I'm talking about the intellectual right.
Okay. Well, that's fair enough. But as you say, much of this is moot since the judiciary ruled just the other day, and there is a war going on, and I suspect that the war is going to be really critical in shaping what's going to happen the day after with the current Israeli government, and perhaps even the fates of versions of these reforms down the road.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, this has been a very enlightening conversation. I've definitely learned a great deal. My opinion is the same as it was starting out, though. And again, part of that's just I'm more concerned about the war at the moment than anything else. Any final words?
No, I think some of our JSCN supporters are not going to agree with me on this, but that's okay. In fact, most of them are probably going to oppose my views on this, but some of them do agree.
I think it's split. No, I think you have a consent. Out of our 200 signatories, I would wager that about 70 to 75 support your view.
Oh, it's got to be a lot lower than that.
Think so? Okay.
Yeah, I would say
we can take a poll on our JSCN page, but only 3 people ever answer our poll, so that's not the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. But again, my opinion is not opposing the reforms. I never said I oppose them as an idea. I just have issues with the way this process is unfolding and with the people who are involved. That's my problem. I think there's a major issue with the way balance of power and checks and balances have been instituted in Israel. And at the time, just to go back to Ben Gurion, it was tactically at the time a very wise move, but strategically in the long run, it wasn't. And it's not just about, the different visions of what Zionism is. It was also about the extent to which the religious parties were going to get power, and he needed to get the religious parties on board. And that was one of the major issues here, why there isn't a constitution, because the religious parties, he needed them in his government. And one of the most brilliant moves he made, which again, in the long run might be disastrous, was him working out a deal with Rav Kook in the 1920s, because he brought the religious people on board, or at least the growing faction of religious Jews who were reformulating their theology to think that Zionism was a good course forward. Religious Zionism was born with those people. It did not exist before that, or at least in that form.
And you see this as a bad development?
In the long run, yes, because it's given the religious people too much power, and it's forced every subsequent government to bring the religious factions into power, because every government is needed to relied on their support. Ben Gurion did not want 2 groups in his government. One was Herut.
The religious Zionists are rarely parts of governments.
Not the religious parties.
So you're talking about you're including the Haredim.
Yeah, because in the 1920s...
It's not the religiosity that's the main thing there. They just want money for their yeshivas, and they want exemption from their military service, things like that.
My point is that Ben Gurion needed to have...
They do want to continue to control the Rabbanim.
Yes, so Ben Gurion... And I want our viewers to understand the extent to which the early Zionists were secular.
And by the way, it's a slight tangent, but I think it needs to be said, there has been an overwhelming increase in Haredim volunteering to serve in the IDF during this.
That's great. I would conscript their asses into the military, but that's just my opinion. But whether they're religious Zionists or people who are, one way or another, whatever, when it comes to Zionism, I mean, they're still ultimately in Israel, and they vote and they have their parties and whatnot, so they are an important demographic. But Ben-Gurion realized early on that he needed to get factions,
And
whatever their views on
45% of the casualties in this Gaza war have been religious Zionists.
Okay, well, maybe they need to be trained a little bit better beforehand, and not so many of them will get killed. I thank you, Haredim, for your service to a
That's
country
what I'm
that
asking you to do.
citizenship.
Right.
I respect you for serving in the military. But my point is that whatever their views on Zionism or on theocracy, and I think some of them share views on theocracy, even if they are not in agreement on Zionism. Ben-Gurion understood that he needed to work out a deal with them. Okay. Now, again, a man coming out of the Pale of Settlement in the 1903 to 1905, embracing a radical leftist, and Zionism is leftist in that context, ideology, to make a deal with the religious parties, to make a deal with religious fundamentalists, is actually a really remarkable thing to do.
Well, he thought that they were going to go away. He thought that religious
I think it was
Judaism was going to go away, dissipate after 20 years.
It was a profound miscalculation in the long run, but in the short run, it made perfect sense. He needed it to create his power base. And as I tell my students, Israel had all the trappings necessary for an independent state a good decade before they had such an independent state, right? Ben-Gurion controlled the labor unions. They had a government in the making through the Yishuv. They had a military,
two that were at odds with each other.
So they what?
Two militaries, though.
Yeah, and even they ended up working it out, right? The Irgun wasn't as popular though as the Haganah, but I think the Haganah needed the Irgun. They needed somebody to do their dirty work, and they were kind of fine with letting them do it. But the point is that he was able to set up the institutions of government quite well without really thinking about the long-term consequences here of no constitution, of religious people multiplying. He did not want Herut, that is to say Likud, and he did not want the communists, who were incredibly powerful in the early days of Israel. They had a lot of support. And I mean real communists, people who believed in class conflict, which is not what the labor Zionists of Ben-Gurion believed. They were not into that. They chose nationalism over class conflict. But there were a lot of communists. He did not want them in their government. Bring in the religious party. They want to control kashrut, they want to control marriage, whatever, let them have it. But at least I'm going to be able to form a government. And it worked out. It was a brilliant move in the short run. But in the long run, once you lose charismatic leaders like Ben-Gurion and some of his successors, you start to have a problem. And you have that problem today, I think. So
I don't see it as nearly as much of a problem as you do, but that's another debate we can have.
I worry for the future. That's all I say. I worry for the future of the extent to which theocracy starts to further penetrate the Israeli government. I'd like to think that those frolicking on the Tel Aviv beaches have strength in numbers, and they will not let that happen. So I think that's, I'm not saying that there's a disaster necessarily looming. I'm just saying it's a possibility that's on the horizon. So just to finish off again with the necessary reforms, I do think there needs to be some sort of check on religion instituted in whatever future constitutional arrangement the Israeli government or the Israeli people come to.
Well, I mean, I don't see the conventional thinking is that Israel incorporates too much religion in their public policy, right? And that
I agree with that. I think that's a problem.
They merge synagogue and state far more than is necessary. But I will suggest to you that is actually the other way around, that Israel does more to keep religion out of the affairs of the state than most countries do.
What about their marriage laws? I mean, their marriage laws.
Marriage law, there's no civil marriage, right? So what the government is doing is they're saying we're not going to decide who's married and who's not. In other words, they're saying we're not going to weigh in on something that is a religious matter. The religious court needs to make that decision. You take it up with your own religion.
Yeah, but that's a problem for people who want.
We should do that in the United States. We should do that in the United States. We should.
You're crazy.
No, I'm not crazy. I've been arguing this for years. We need to eradicate civil marriage in the United States and let it be a private thing.
Okay, but Israel does have some sort of civil marriage, meaning that two people can shack up together and get all the benefits that a married couple would get,
right?
Or gay, and they don't actually need that piece of paper. So in effect, yes, they have reduced marriage to a piece of paper, signed off on by a religious institution or organization. And those who do not go through that process can actually just live their normal life as a quote couple with every benefit that a married couple would have, aside from the religious related ones, right? I mean, that's the whole point here.
Well, they have like the common law marriages, yes.
Yes, there have been, I mean, and there's been,
Yeah.
in that sense, there's been gay marriage in Israel for a lot longer than there's been in the United States,
Mhm.
for that very reason. On the other hand, there are people who they believe there's a certain amount of dignity that comes with the right to being married, and they think there's a problem with their state not willing to weigh in on the right to get
Only
married.
because they see it as society abnormalizing their behavior, that they don't get to be involved in the same traditions and rituals and practices as everyone else. That's the only reason.
Well, if you favor the current
There's no-
situation where any two people can shack up and do whatever the hell they want and it counts as a marriage, then you are a radical. You are someone who's, for the radical abolition of marriage for all intents and purposes.
Well, kind of. In a way, I've sort of had to recently align myself with people that want to do that. I still believe very much in marriage, which is why I want something like this. It's the only way to protect it, to turn it into something that is entirely religious.
Okay, I mean, in the Israeli variation, I suppose it does work, but we can go back to Tsarist Russia, and Chava had to convert to Orthodoxy if she was going to shack up with Fiedka, or Sviedka. It was the only way it was going to happen.
All I'm saying is that this is not theocratic. It is the opposite of theocratic.
Yeah, I guess there's a case to be made for that. All I know is when I was in Israel in 1987, I couldn't get McDonald's because there was no way of getting kosher potatoes that would meet the strict halachic standards of those who controlled food distribution at the time. Now, I know McDonald's does exist today, and I know that's a small matter, but the food in Israel was not great in 1987, so it wasn't really a small matter.
Well, I don't go to Israel to eat at McDonald's, although I did eat at a kosher McDonald's.
Okay, you live on a kibbutz for 2 weeks and you eat the shit that they're serving you, you're going to want to eat McDonald's after that.
All right, yeah.
That's all I have to say.
I think that we've gone over the time limit on
Oh,
this.
yeah. Okay, well, let's end off. To those of you who have not hung up on us yet, thank you for sticking through. I believe what was a very interesting discussion about Israeli politics, leaving most of our usual topics aside. Anti-Zionism, I don't even think really came up tonight. This was very enlightening, not as much fun as our Jesus one, of course, because that was really entertaining and intellectual at the same time. So we do hope you tune in to our future episodes. We've got some great stuff coming up, including the DEI lady. What's her name?
Tabia Lee.
Tabia Lee, right?
Dr. Tabia Lee.
Yeah, we'll be interviewing her or having her as a guest very soon. And she lost her job or resigned from her position because of the DEI practices at the institution she worked at. And she will have some great stories and horror stories to tell us. All right, this is Jarrod and Adam.
Lastly, add one more thing. The thing that makes our podcast great, and the reason that you should watch, is because we combine entertainment with intellectualism, right? That we don't take ourselves too seriously here. We could have conversations about important topics, but do it in a lighthearted manner.
And we haven't put anyone in the hospital. Let's not forget that.
Right.
Shout out to you know who. All right. We are now signing off on that note. Thank you for watching.
Goodbye.